Other people may look at the same facts and come to a different conclusion. Obviously they have, but that represents my view as president. In some areas involving the national interest, the news would be worse before it gets better. And I think that the American people might just as well realize that.
Thank you. Talked about and read stories of 7,000 to 15,000 guerrillas operating in Vietnam, killing 2,000 civil officers a year, 2,000 police officers a year, 4,000. Now, there's been an election in Vietnam in which 75% of the people or 80% endorse the government. And yet we read how Vietnam is in danger because of guerrilla operations carried on by this small, well-disciplined, well-supplied, across the border group of guerrillas. How we fight that kind of a problem, which is going to be with us all through this decade, seems to me to be one of the great problems now before the United States.
The issue of what Kennedy might have done in Vietnam is both fascinating and potentially important. I like to call it virtual history. Professional historians traditionally call it counterfactual history. I suppose because there's factual history, that is, the story of what happened, and then there's an infinite number of stories about what didn't happen. That would be your counterfactual history. The most famous example of this, the one that's usually held up by people who don't like the idea of, in effect, writing the history that didn't happen, is to suppose that history would have been far, far different if Cleopatra had had a longer nose and Mark Antony hadn't taken an interest in her, and the whole story of the Roman Empire would be different, and if the story of the Roman Empire would be different, the history of the Western world would be different, and if the history of the Western world were different, the history of the whole world would be different. And so therefore, everything in history hinges on the length of Cleopatra's nose. Now you can take it to this absurd level, and it's often done by people who are worried about the chaos or the anarchy of a history that delves into things that did not happen.
I'm concerned about the kind of problem which I just described. I don't feel satisfied that we have an effective answer to it yet. I think it's a matter of the greatest possible concern to all of us, because I think events are moving with some speed.
Does it matter who's president on issues of war and peace? Can a president make a decisive difference in matters of war and peace? Can a president decisively lead his country into war or keep his country out of war? Or are the forces that drive nations into conflict far more impersonal, out of the control of any single human being, even a president? The issue of what Kennedy might have done, why is it interesting? One reason is obviously related to the scope of the tragedy. Wouldn't there have been some way to avoid it? That would be worth knowing.
Do you have personally fallout shelters in any of the residences that you frequently use? I'm thinking particularly of your house in Hyannis, or in Middleburg, or in Palm Beach, or at Newport.
Well, they're not all my residents, I'm sorry to say, but I will say that I would say that there are naturally provisions for the protection of those in presidency and in the Joint Chiefs of Staff and others who would have to maintain responsibility in case of a military action. Though, of course, there's no sure answer for anybody. Obviously, you cannot build a shelter in the accepted sense of the word for the kind of money which we have talked about, but we can provide directions whereby a family can take steps to protect themselves on a minimum basis and give them, members of the family, some hope that if they're out of the blast area, they could survive the fallout. And by the middle of November, we hope to suggest some of the steps that every homeowner could take. My own feeling is that these shelters are most useful and most important. And we're going to live through a long period of constant tension with these dangerous weapons which will be proliferating.
The Cold War was cold in the sense that it was not characterized by a hot or shooting war between the two most powerful countries, the superpowers. The peace was kept primarily because of the existence of strategic nuclear weapons. Each side had more than enough nuclear weapons to completely destroy the other. So any direct military conflict between the two ran a strong risk of actually destroying one or both societies and possibly all of civilization with it.
As he said he would, Mr. Khrushchev has exploded his giant bomb in cynical disregard of the United Nations. By this act, the Soviet Union have added injury to insult. They broke the moratorium on nuclear weapons testing. They have started a new race for more deadly weapons. The United States delegation deeply deplores this contempt for world opinion.
A sufficient number of those weapons would survive the Soviet surprise attack to literally be capable of destroying the Soviet Union. In the meantime, the Soviet Union undoubtedly would have attacked Western Europe. The net effect of this exchange would probably be 100 million casualties in the Soviet Union, perhaps 50+ million casualties in the United States, perhaps 100 million casualties in Europe. There can be no winner in that kind of a situation.
We happen to live, because of the ingenuity of science and man's own inability to control his relationship one with another, we happen to live in the most dangerous time in the history of the human race.
Each side completely mistrusted the other. Each side believed that the two ways of organizing society were completely incompatible with each other. And so the question arises really for the first time, how does the competition between these two most powerful countries in the world take place without them destroying each other in the process and everything else with it? It's at this point, in the 50s and 60s, that the competition between these two countries moves to other parts of the world.
No, I don't want to comment in detail on the situation in South Vietnam because it is a very complex one. I think Ambassador Lodge, when he returned, said that there were 43 different wars there, and whether there are 43 different wars or not, it's a very complicated situation involving political, economic, and military factors, and I don't think we can expect to give day-to-day accounts of the improvement or retrogression in the situation. But I do call your attention again to this one important point, that the rate of Viet Cong incidents is high. And as long as that rate of incidents is high, and by an incident I mean a terror attack, as long as that rate of incidents is high, it means that the security of the people is low, and as long as in certain areas of the country, and as long as the security of the people is low in certain areas of the country, their allegiance to the government will be in doubt, and it's that which makes the problem for us.
The trick, I think, in engaging this issue in a way that all open-minded people can come together on would be to look a little more closely at the factual. Let's get the database. Let's see what Kennedy did. Now, what's the issue? Well, he did a lot of things, of course. But When pressure is put on Kennedy by most or all or some of his advisors to commit the United States to a war, what does he do? Should there be a pattern here in Kennedy's behavior? Or we might say, if we're thinking sort of psychologically, if he has a habit of deciding one way rather than another, maybe we have some information that we can apply to that other thing that he didn't live to deal with. 6 times when he was put to the test, John Kennedy avoided war all 6 times. He avoided conventional war, and he avoided nuclear war. I'm not saying he was a perfect president, but that particular feature of his presidency is really interesting. 1961 may have been one of the worst years an American president ever had.
Esos valores ahora estarán presentes. Ahora a este país se le pide un internacionalismo, una misión internacionalista extraordinaria. Salvar la revolución en Cuba. Salvar el socialismo en Cuba.
Immediately after Kennedy was inaugurated, in a sense, all hell broke loose. He had inherited a crisis. About 1,200 Cuban exiles were being trained in the jungles in Guatemala to get on American ships that had been repainted so that nobody would know they were, wink, wink, American ships. And they are going to overthrow the Castro government. The Cuban exiles have landed at the Bay of Pigs. They are getting beaten, and the call goes out for help. Help is near in the form of American troop ships carrying several thousand U.S. Marines, which are located less than 2 miles offshore. And suddenly Kennedy is besieged with advisors saying, look, this thing is going belly up, it's going under, our guys are going to get crushed, Castro's going to win, all that kind of stuff. But you have an option. You can send in the Marines and begin the conquering or the reconquering of Cuba and the destruction of the Cuban Revolution.
The president of a great democracy, such as ours, and the editors of great newspapers, such as yours, owe a common obligation to the people. An obligation to present the facts, to present them with candor. It is with that obligation in mind that I have decided in the last 24 hours to discuss briefly at this time the recent events in Cuba. Any unilateral American intervention in the absence of an external attack upon ourselves or an ally would have been contrary to our traditions and to our international obligations. We intend to profit from this lesson. We intend to re-examine and reorient our forces of all kinds. We intend to intensify our efforts for a struggle in many ways more difficult than war.
I know that many of you have further questions about Cuba. I made a statement on that subject yesterday afternoon. I do not think that any useful national purpose would be served by my going further into the Cuban question this morning. I prefer to let my statement of yesterday suffice for the present.
Reporters in Washington have noticed that there's been a clamming up of information from formerly useful sources, and this morning we are not permitted to ask any further questions about this foreign policy situation. Why is it not useful, sir, for us to explore with you the real facts behind this or our motivations?
Well, I think in answer to your question that we have to make a judgment as to how much we can usefully say that would aid the interest of the United States. One of the problems of a free society, problem not met by a dictatorship, is this problem of information. A good deal has been printed in the paper. I wouldn't be surprised if those of you who are members of the press will be receiving a lot of background briefings in the next day or two by interested people or interested agencies. There's an old saying that victory has 100 fathers and defeat is an orphan. And I wouldn't be surprised if information is poured into you in regard to all the recent activities. But I will say to you, Mr. Van Oka, that I've said as much as I feel can be usefully said by me in regard to the events of the past few days. Further statements, detailed discussions are not to conceal responsibility, because I'm the responsible officer of the government.
Quite respecting your feeling of not going beyond your statement of yesterday on Cuba, there still is in print this morning that you took the decision to continue training Cuban refugees with arms provided by this government for launching the current operations in Cuba. Now, is this true?
I think that the facts of the matter involving the Cuban will come out in due time, and I'm sure that an effort will be made to determine the facts accurately. As for me, I'm confining myself to my statement, for good reason.
Kennedy personally called the commander of that ship, Admiral Arleigh Burke, and said, "Stop. We are not getting involved in jungle warfare 90 miles south of Florida." He ordered the ship to move away from the shore, and this was so difficult for him. All of these people are veterans of both the Second World War and the Korean War and the Cold War in the 1950s, and these guys are fighters. That's what they think they've been trained to do, and that's what their experience tells them. Also, their experience tells them that if the Americans apply military force, they win. Americans came in late in World War I. Americans think they won the war. World War II, they also came in late. Americans did win the war. Korean War, they saved at least half of Korea. Cold War, they staved off the Soviet threat. And these guys cannot understand why this young punk, I mean, I think would be the right word, not in terms of what Kennedy was actually like, but the way they sort of reacted to this. Nixon wrote that the lesson in the Bay of Pigs was that Kennedy lacked the spine to send in the Marines, to send in the Air Force, to unseat Castro, to assassinate Castro, occupy the country, to put a government in charge in Havana more congenial to U.S. interests. That was the lesson. There were rumors of impeachment. There were rumors that this young guy was completely incompetent. I mean, these hoodlums in these green outfits have beaten the United States of America, which won the Second World War, which won the First World War. There was no category within which to conceive of this outcome. We don't know a lot about what happened to Kennedy in the South Pacific, but he almost died, and that was a real crisis. This is probably comparable to that. It's a crisis. It's a crisis. It's a personal crisis. It's a crisis of his presidency that's barely gotten underway. And it's a crisis in the credibility of the United States of America. I think failure is the operative word here. Kennedy has failed, but Kennedy also knows he will be perceived as a failure.
Taken into the kitchen and introduced to all the help who were just over from Ireland. I saw Chris Dunphy, who told me Mrs. Fraser's sister, Mrs. Ayres, does not think that I'm serious about politics and therefore cannot support me.
At the very first meeting held in private, Kennedy was described as traumatized, as shocked. Chester Bowles, a State Department official, was at that meeting, said that John F. Kennedy looked completely crushed. He sat through a 45-minute meeting while all the cabinet secretaries were arguing with each other about whose fault it was and what should have been done and what shouldn't have been done. Kennedy didn't say a word, and in one of the most ghostly passages I've ever read in a classified memo, Bowles says the president, looking pale, stood up and walked out of the room without speaking. so much for the way it looked and felt. What did he learn?
I am not a candidate for office for at least 4 years, so that there will be many ups and downs, I suppose, during that period. So that anybody who thinks that if things get better in the spring, that we'll be able to say that they're the result of the administration's policy, and that's the reason that I painted them unnecessarily dark, misunderstands completely. They are painted accurately as I understand them to be. And anyone who makes a judgment that it was laid on thick for political reasons, I think is making a serious mistake, and I hope would give us the benefit of the doubt of an honest view. Now, other people may look at the same facts and come to a different conclusion. Obviously they have, but that represents my view as president. In some areas involving the national interest, the news would be worse before it gets better. And I think that the American people might just as well realize that.
These three maps show the area of effective communist domination as it was last August, with the colored portions up on the right-hand corner being the areas held and dominated by the communists at that time. And now next, in December of 1960, 3 months ago, the red area having expanded, and now from December 20th now to the present date, near the end of March, the communists control a much wider section of the country. Soviet planes, I regret to say, have been conspicuous in a large-scale airlift into the battle area, plus a whole supporting set of combat specialists, mainly from communist North Vietnam, and heavier weapons have been provided from outside. I want to make it clear to the American people and to all the world that all we want in Laos is peace, not war. A truly neutral government, not a Cold War pawn. A settlement concluded at the conference table and not on the battlefield.
I think, ladies and gentlemen, that is enough.
Mr. Gromyko,
I said what I have in mind.
Mr. Gromyko, is the Soviet Union willing to agree to a ceasefire in Laos?
We touched in conversation this subject. I have nothing to say publicly at this moment.
Is the purpose of Mr. Ross going to the Senator's preparation of asking for a declaration of war in case it really becomes a shooting matter out there?
The communists seem to be putting us on the defensive on a number of fronts.
I wonder if you could tell us how long this government is prepared to wait before it proposes some new action to resolve this continuing crisis.
A shocking crisis with the emergence of a crisis in a country called Laos, a landlocked mountainous kingdom. The CIA reported that the Soviet Union was giving blatant and considerable support to the Pathet Lao, the communist insurgency in Laos, and that unless the U.S. did something about it, the communists would take over Laos and the domino would fall. Another country would go communist. And this country bordered South Vietnam, which the U.S. was propping up and supporting. So he was told by his military and many of his civilian advisors, you cannot let this happen. I know you don't know where it is or what this is all about, but you've got to do something to show the Russians that we mean business. So Kennedy did, sort of. He ordered some troops off some ships, and he ordered them up to the Thai border with Laos. And that was all he did. Not one U.S. combat troop ever set foot in Laos. But at the same time, he began conversations with the Kremlin, indirectly and directly.
Careful negotiations are being conducted with many countries at the present time in order to see that we have taken every possible course to ensure a peaceful solution.
And within a very short time, 2 months, by May, there was a ceasefire. American troops, which had never even gone into Laos, then retreat, get back on their ships and sail away. The Soviets, more or less, get in their airplanes and fly back to the Soviet Union, and a negotiation begins, which will result in a kind of treaty which provides a neutral solution for Laos.
President, Vice President Nixon seems to be taking a dim view of your administration. He said in a speech yesterday that never in American history has a man talked so big and acted so little. Do you have anything to say about this?
No, I wouldn't comment on Mr. Nixon. He has been engaged and busy, and I sympathize with the traveling problems he has and his other problems, but I don't have any response to make. We're doing the best we can. We'll continue to do so until 1964, and then we can see what the situation looks like.
Republican National Committee recently adopted a resolution saying you were pretty much of a failure.
Well, I'm sure it was passed unanimously.
The source of world trouble and tension is Moscow, not Berlin. And if war begins, it will have begun in Moscow and not Berlin.
Are you basing your judgment on the assumption that it is conceivable that we might fight a ground war in Europe over Berlin?
On August 13th, 1961, the East Germans and Soviets began putting up the Berlin Wall. And I mean the whole of the Western world just held its breath, because American tanks moved into position and Soviet tanks moved into position where this wall was going up, and the thought was, well, what are they going to do?
The talks which we had with Mr. Gromyko did not give us immediate hope that this matter would be easily settled.
If fighting should break out over Berlin, that is, if peace efforts fail, do you believe it can be limited to a conventional war, or would it lead to the use of nuclear weapons?
If one takes the public statements of the two sides at face value, it would seem that the U.S. and the USSR are on something of a collision course here.
Do you think, generally speaking, sir, that the crisis in Berlin has a better chance of being settled through negotiation, as you have suggested, rather than by force, as the Soviets have threatened upon occasion?
Well, I don't see that there could be any solution which would serve the world to Berlin by force. And therefore, I'm hopeful that all people involved will realize that in these days of with massive forces available on every side, that for the future of the countries involved and for the human race, that we should attempt to work out a peaceful solution.
General Lucius Clay, who was the American commander in Berlin, ignoring orders from Kennedy and from McGeorge Bundy, his national security advisor, moved his tanks right up to the border. I mean, like right up to the line. He moved them up there, he lined them up, he loaded them up with live ammunition, he pointed them directly at the Soviet tanks. Not to be outdone, the Soviet tanks, instead of withdrawing, pulled up to the border.
The impression that you had asked that this be done.
Well, now, how did you get that impression?
I got it from Jim Greenfield.
Well, now, wait a sec. I got Pierre right here. He says he's under the impression that we asked that this be done.
Kennedy intervened directly by telephone to Lucius Clay on that potential battlefield and told him to get those goddamn tanks out of sight. One way to deal with this would have been to be confrontational and to just issue a challenge to Khrushchev to back down, prepare for war. In fact, it was Khrushchev who took that approach. What Khrushchev wanted, essentially, was for Kennedy to order the U.S. forces to leave West Berlin, retreat into West Germany, and give him what he thought was his natural right as a conquering Soviet in World War II, which was all of Germany inside the borders of East Germany. Khrushchev once said it would be like having a piece of the Soviet Union in Iowa. You wouldn't accept it. He had a point. And yet, Berlin was regarded, West Berlin was regarded as this bulwark, a kind of a test of how courageous we were in the West. And while Kennedy's advisors are furious, they say you can't let him get away with this, Kennedy goes through the motions. Privately, we know Kennedy was grateful for that wall. What the wall did was to prevent large numbers of people from being shot as they raced across the border from East Berlin to West Berlin. It's sad, and it's a very poignant human story that so many people got trapped behind the wall, but Kennedy has to think in somewhat larger terms about preventing war. And so while he had nothing to do with putting up the wall, he didn't try to tear it down.
Did you make the decision for us not to use force to stop the building of the wall in Berlin? And if you had it to do over again, would you make the same decision, or what would have been the alternative if you had not made that decision?
There have been charges that we have not adequately maintained the strength or the credibility of our nuclear deterrent, and that we also have not fully convinced the leaders of the Soviet Union that we are determined to meet force with force in Berlin or elsewhere.
At the same time, the Republican National Chairman has said that your administration's attitude in general is one of appeasement toward communism throughout the world.
You have been angered, or at least disturbed, by what has been described as partisan criticism of your foreign policy. It has also been reported that some members of your administration, possibly including yourself, have felt that sharp Republican warnings against appeasement have constricted the room that you may have to negotiate with the Russians. Will you discuss these points?
No, I'm going to attempt to, as I have said, protect our vital interests and see whether it's possible for us to reach an agreement in this matter which will not necessitate a war, which could mean so much destruction for so many millions and millions of people in this country and elsewhere. Now, I'm going to continue to do that, and we'll do the best we can, and we'll see what happens. Everyone is free to make any attacks they want. I think what would be most helpful to the nation today would be constructive and frequently critical alternatives, suggestions for alternative courses of action, and not merely rather generalized statements which throw very little light on very complicated and dangerous matters. But I would never suggest that the battle of the mimeograph machines between the Republican committee and the Democratic committee should cease.
American officials are encouraged by the outlook. Another day they read that they're not encouraged, that they're gloomy. One day we're going ahead, the next day we're going back. Mr. President, does the real situation fluctuate that much? As a one-time journalist who became president, how does it look to you?
Well, a lot of journalists have bad luck, and
75% of the people, or 80%, to endorse the government. And yet we read how Vietnam is in danger because of guerrilla operations carried on by this small, well-disciplined, well-supplied, across the border group of guerrillas. How we fight that kind of a problem, which is going to be with us all through this decade, seems to me to be one of the great problems now before the United States. I'm concerned about the kind of problem which I just described. I don't feel satisfied that we have an effective answer to it yet.
General Maxwell Taylor, Kennedy's personal representative, is sent to South Vietnam, which is starting to become an issue. He takes along with him Walt Rostow, the Deputy National Security Advisor. Their instructions are to determine what the problem is over there with this insurgency that seems to be growing and growing and growing, and especially what's the problem with our guy, Diem, and why he can't squash the insurgency.
Decision to send General Taylor to Vietnam. There may be some interpretation of that decision as implying confirmation of reports that you intend to send American forces to Vietnam or to Thailand or to Laos. Can you give us your appraisal of the conditions under which you might find it necessary to send troops in?
Well, we're going to wait till General Taylor comes back and brings an up-to-date description of the situation, particularly in Vietnam. General Taylor will give me and the Joint Chiefs of Staff an educated military guess as to what the situation that the government there faces. And we can come to conclusions as to what is best to do.
They come back, and we're not talking here about the advice of a bunch of warmongers. We're talking about people who believe fervently in the domino theory, that you cannot let South Vietnam fall, you can't let it go communist, because who knows, even Indonesia could go or Japan could go. The rest of the countries in Southeast Asia that are not already communist will just topple over and become communist, and that will be the beginning of the end of the free world as we know it. Now this sounds very apocalyptic, and it is, or was, but people didn't think it was a fantasy. They believed it. Kennedy himself probably believed it.
Vietnam has been in war for 20 years. Japanese came in, the war with the French, the Civil War, which has gone on for 10 years. This is very difficult for any society to stand this. And it's a country which has got a good many problems. It's divided. There's guerrilla activity, murder, and all the rest. We want to see a stable government there carrying on a struggle to maintain its national independence. We believe strongly in that. We're not going to withdraw from that effort. In my opinion, for us to withdraw from that effort would mean a collapse not only of South Vietnam, but Southeast Asia. So we're going to stay there. We hope, with the great effort, which is being carried by the Vietnamese themselves, and they've been in this field a long time, a lot longer than we have, and with a good deal more deaths and casualties, that behind this military shield put up by the Vietnamese people, they can reach an agreement on the civil disturbances and also on respect for the rights of others. That's our hope, that's our effort, we're bringing our influence to bear. The decision is finally theirs, but I think that before we render too harsh a judgment on the people, we should realize that they've gone through a harder time than we've had to go through.
All the advisors, including the military and civilian advisors, they have this feeling that Kennedy is an unknown quantity. Where is Kennedy going to come out with regard to the question of what to do in November 1961 in South Vietnam? It's totally clear to them, absolutely clear to them, what needs to be done. But if Kennedy doesn't go along with it, then we got a problem. And so rather than go to the president and call the meeting, there are other meetings being held out in the Defense Department, in the Pentagon, or in the State Department, or in the basement of the White House in McGeorge Bundy's office. And the reason that there's a lot more meeting going on in preparation here is they're trying to figure out how to build the case to Kennedy that they absolutely, positively, in effect, need to go to war in South Vietnam. At a 10 a.m. to noon meeting on November 15th, 1961 at the White House, Kennedy faced off like a chess master against every one of his top advisors, who were recommending anything from a small troop commitment to a very large troop commitment. They argued for 2 hours, and he said, "You're not getting one combat troop. None. Zero. What else do you want? Planes? Okay. Advisors? Okay, we're gonna give them a lot of advisors. Okay, we can do these kinds of things." They went to that meeting absolutely convinced that they were right in their opinion that the United States must commit their troops to South Vietnam, and they must do it as soon as possible. Kennedy said no.
On the occasion of your New Year's celebration, my fellow Americans and I extend our very best wishes for the prosperity and well-being of the government and the people of Vietnam. We in America sincerely hope that the year of the Tiger will see peace come again to Vietnam.
Your predecessor in office called himself a political moderate, said he believed in the middle-of-the-road approach. What do you call yourself politically, and how do you define your political philosophy?
Well, I don't call myself anything except a Democrat who's been elected President of the United States. And I hope I am a responsible president. That's my intention.
There are many Americans who believe that in our manner of questioning or seeking your attention, that we're subjecting you to some abuse or a lack of respect. I wonder, sir, in this light, could you tell us generally your feelings about your press conferences to date and your feelings about how they're conducted?
Well, you subject me to some abuse, but not to any lack of respect, I don't think.
This government, as promised,
has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Only last Thursday, as evidence of this rapid offensive buildup was already in my hand, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko told me in my office that he was instructed to make it clear once again, as he said his government had already done, that Soviet assistance to Cuba, and I quote, pursue solely the purpose of contributing to the defense capabilities of Cuba, unquote. That, and I quote him, training by Soviet specialists of Cuban nationals in handling defensive armaments was by no means offensive. And that if it were otherwise, Mr. Gromyko went on, the Soviet government would never become involved in rendering such assistance, unquote. That statement also was false.
Mr. President, I am submitting today a resolution to the Security Council designed to find a way out of this calamitous situation.
The Cuban Missile Crisis was the most dangerous crisis this country or any country has ever faced. There were so many points during the missile crisis when a president who was not as cautious or skeptical as Kennedy would have done things, would have sent ships into regions, would have attacked certain targets.
The fact that you refer back to my speech, that then gives them a lead headline saying the United States is planning further action. And we had a long talk about it this morning, and it was agreed that the talk about the statement on the buildup would come from the White House, and that we wouldn't say anything about what action we're going to take. And we don't want to, when you make a reference back to my speech, it then gives them a lead that further action is going to be taken. Now, we got to get this under control, I think, because it's too important. I want it to be run out of the White House. Under me, to Salinger, to you people, and to Sylvester. And nothing dealing with the Cuban crisis of any importance is to go out until it goes through Salinger and comes to me. Because I don't want to be critical, but the problem is when you say further action is going to be taken, then they all say what action? And it moves this escalation up a couple of days when we're not ready for it.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
So therefore, you have to be goddamn careful. You just can't make references to past speeches because that gives them a new headline, and they've now got it. And every reporter in town is going to be putting together Pierre Salinger's release about the missile thing with your thing, that further action, and we're going to find ourselves getting out of control. Okay.
Well, I'm terribly sorry, sir.
Okay.
Mr. President, you know we've been meeting on this subject ever since we discovered the presence of missiles in Cuba. And I would say the debates in our own midst have followed very closely parallel those that you've heard from your other advisors. From the outset, I would say that we felt we were not united on the military requirement here.
Let me just say a little first about what the problem is from this point, my point of view. We attack Cuba, the missiles, or Cuba in any way, give them a clear line to take Berlin, as they were able to do Hungary under the Anglo war in Egypt. We regarded as the trigger-happy Americans who lost Berlin. We would have no support among our allies. We would affect West Germany's attitude towards us, and they don't give a damn about Cuba. And they do care about Berlin and about their own security, so they will say that we endangered their interests and security.
And emphasize a little strongly, perhaps, that we don't have any choice except direct military action. Now, as for the Berlin situation, I don't share your view that if we knock off Cuba, they're going to knock off Berlin.
What do you think their reprisal would be?
I don't think they're going to make any reprisal. If we tell them that the Berlin situation is just like it's always been. If they make a move, we're going to fight. Mr. President, I feel that the course of action recommended to you by the chiefs from a military point of view is the right one. It's quite obvious that what they would think they could do is try to get Berlin. But that may be a risk we have to take, but I think... history's been, I think, the other way, Mr. President. So I see no other solution. This blockade and political action I see leading into war. I don't see any other solution. This is almost as bad as the appeasement of Munich. I think that a blockade and political talk would be considered by a lot of our friends and neutrals as being a pretty weak response to this, and I'm sure a lot of our own citizens would feel that way too. In other words, you're in a pretty bad fix, President. You're in a pretty bad fix.
I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. A strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to stable relations between our two nations.
I have several statements. I have today been informed by Chairman Khrushchev that all of the IL-28 bombers now in Cuba will be withdrawn in 30 days. He also agrees that these planes can be observed and counted as they leave.
Former Governor of Florida, now head of the National Association of Broadcasters, has accused both the Defense Department and the State Department of news suppression in the Cuban crisis. Would you care to comment on your general feeling about that, Mr. President?
It is true that when we learned the matter on Tuesday morning, until we made the announcement on the quarantine on Monday afternoon, that this matter was kept in the highest levels of government. We didn't make any public statement about it. And I returned to Washington that Saturday morning because I had a campaign trip that was going to take me till Sunday evening, and I had to come back, and we did not want to indicate to the Soviet Union or to Cuba or anyone else who might be our adversaries the extent of our information until we had determined what our policy would be and until we had consulted with our allies. So for those very good reasons, I believe, this matter was kept by the government until Monday night. There is at least one newspaper learned about some of the details on Sunday evening and did not print it for reasons of public interest. I have no apologies for that. I don't think that there's any doubt that it would have been a great mistake and possibly a disaster if this news had dribbled out when we were unsure of the extent of the Soviet buildup in Cuba, and when we were unsure of our response, and when we had not consulted with any of our allies who might themselves have been involved in great difficulties as a result of our action. During the week then, from Monday till Sunday, when we received Mr. Khrushchev's first message about the withdrawal, we attempted to have the government speak with one voice. There were obvious restraints on newspaper men. They were not permitted, for example, to go to Guantanamo because obviously that might be an area which might be under attack. Since that Sunday, we have tried to, or at least attempt to lift any restraints from the news. And I'm really, as a reader of a good many papers, it seems to me that the papers have more or less reflected quite accurately the state of our negotiations with the Soviet Union. They have, in a sense, been suspended because we've been arguing about this question of IL-28s. So there hasn't been any real progress that we could point to or any hard information that we could put out until today, which we're now doing. Now, if the procedures which have been set up, which are really to protect the interest of security of the United States, are being used in a way inimical to the free flow of news, then we will change those procedures.
The other day, Khrushchev stated that communists could learn something even from capitalists, and he even had a few kind words to say about profit incentives. Do you read any great amount of significance into this?
No, I don't. No. The people of Florida are hoping that you and your family will again spend Christmas with them. Can you tell us what your present plans are, sir? My father and mother are going to Florida in December, and my wife and children hope to go there for Christmas, and if my situation here permits, I will go in Christmas. If the question is the result of some stories that the tourist business in Florida is off because of our difficulties, I don't think it'll be too, I hope it will not be too dangerous in Florida this year.
Senator Goldwater accused your administration today of falsification of the news in order to perpetuate itself in office. Would you care to comment on that?
What was he referring to?
Making a speech here at the Women's National Press Club, and his point was that you and your administration are mismanaging the news and using it to perpetuate yourself in office.
Well, as I've said before, I think it would be unwise at this time to answer or reply to Senator Goldwater. I'm confident that he'll be making many charges, even more serious than this one, in the coming months. And in addition, he himself has had a busy week selling TVA and giving permission to suggesting that military commanders overseas be permitted to use nuclear weapons, attacking the president of Bolivia while he was here in the United States, involving himself in the Greek election. So I thought that it really would be not fair for me this week to reply to him.
Mr. President, back to the question of troop reductions. Are any intended in the Far East at the present time, particularly in Korea, and is there any speed up in the withdrawals from Vietnam intended?
Well, as you know, when Secretary McNamara and General Taylor came back, they announced that we would expect to withdraw 1,000 men from South Vietnam before the end of the year. And there's been some reference to that by General Hawkins. If we were able to do that, that will be our schedule. I think the first unit, the first contingent, would be 250 men who are not involved in what might be called frontline operations. It would be our hope to lessen the number of Americans there by 1,000 as the training intensifies and is carried on in South Vietnam.
He should start talking within about 7 or 8 minutes, assuming he arrives within the next few minutes. And he plans to speak for 20 minutes. However, his schedule is so tight, he's due in Dallas in less than 2.5 hours. There had been plans for him to leave from here in an open car. And for our Dallas viewers, the motorcade downtown will go Lemon to Turtle Creek, then down Cedar Springs to Harwood, down Main, circle the courthouse, then out Stemmons Freeway to the Trade Mart. When the president appeared out in the parking lot, he broke one of the cardinal rules of security. He went out into the crowd, and of course Secret Service men find this the most nervous time of any presidential appearance. Another rule is that anyone who approaches the president should have both hands visible. On September 6, 1901, those two rules were broken. President William McKinley was appearing at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, and at a public reception, the crowd moved in around him, and the three Secret Service men who were guarding him had no chance to screen the people approaching him. Here comes the president. From the reaction, that's Mrs. Kennedy coming in. She's been standing outside in the kitchen waiting for the introduction of the guests at the head table to be completed. Now she is moving up to the front of the ballroom, mounting the dais. For the ladies in the audience, she's wearing a pink outfit trimmed in black. If I knew more about it, I'd tell you the kind of material. It looks like a nubby material.
2 years ago, I said that, introduced myself in Paris by saying that I was the man who had accompanied Mrs. Kennedy to Paris. I'm getting somewhat that same sensation as I travel around Texas. Nobody wonders what Lyndon and I wear, but But this is a very dangerous and uncertain world. As I said earlier, on 3 occasions in the last 3 years, the United States has had a direct confrontation. No one can say when it will come again.
They couldn't let you leave Fort Worth without providing you with some protection against the rain.
Put it on in the White House on Monday. If you'll come up there, you'll have a chance to see it there.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago. Vice President Lyndon Johnson has left the hospital in Dallas, but we do not know to where he has proceeded. Presumably, he will be taking the oath of office shortly and become the 36th President of the United States.
It turns out that John F. Kennedy was pressured more often and more strongly by more people to take this nation to war than any president ever was within 1,000 days that he had to work with. If we take the fundamental issue to be how profoundly did this man resist the urge to war in Vietnam, in Laos, in Cuba, during the missile crisis of the Bay of Pigs, or in Berlin, if we take that as our fundamental variable of the thing that we really are paying attention to, it's almost unavoidable that we conclude that he wasn't going to have that war in Vietnam.
Together we shall save our planet, or together we shall perish in its flames. Save it we can, and save it we must. And then shall we earn the eternal thanks of mankind, and as peacemakers, the eternal blessing of God.
First, examine our attitude towards peace itself. Too many of us think it is impossible. Too many think it is unreal. But that is a dangerous, defeatist belief. It leads to the conclusion that war is inevitable, that mankind is doomed, that we are gripped by forces we cannot control. We need not accept that view. Our problems are man-made. Therefore, they can be solved by man. The United States, as the world knows, will never start a war. We do not want a war. We do not now expect a war. This generation of Americans has already had enough of war and hate.
Does the fact that you're sending additional forces to Vietnam imply any change in the existing policy of relying mainly on the South Vietnamese?
He told White House reporters that he could imagine the war over there going on for 5, 6, or 7 years. Have you thought of that possibility, sir?
Could you tell us whether you believe this war, as you now call it, can be contained in this corner of Southeast Asia without involving a U.S.-Soviet confrontation?
Governor Hatfield of Oregon said the most recent escalation of action in Vietnam is moving all the people of the earth closer to World War III, and we have no moral right to commit the world, and especially our own people, to World War III unilaterally or by the decision of a few experts. This seems to imply rather strong criticism of present policies.
Yes, I don't interpret it that way. I think there are dangers in escalation. I don't think I have any right to commit the whole world to World War III. I'm doing everything I know how to avoid it. But retreat is not necessarily the best way to avoid it.
It is 1965. The Democratic majority in both houses of Congress has increased. It was positively ruination for the Republicans. So Johnson is in a position that Kennedy was never in, or anybody else was ever in up to that point. I'm not saying he could do what he wanted, but the choices open to Johnson, particularly with regard to Vietnam, it was a very wide array of them. He could do everything from end all U.S. involvement and manage that politically because all of his people were in charge in the Congress, or he could choose to escalate.
Plus the fact that a man that drills an oil well and
enter Hubert Humphrey.
He finally hits one, he can take all of the deductions for all of the losses that he had before.
But Senator,
there are
isn't that
45 separate gratuities or benefits given by the government for mining and gas and oil development. 45, which you didn't have in 1925, and I say that it's absolutely wrong in the year 19...
Insofar as the supply of oil and other critical raw materials are concerned.
That's correct. The supply is even, the known supply today is much greater than it was in 1925.
The known consumption is many times
say
greater.
That the bond market for gas and oil wells are gilt-edged securities, and the profit percentage in gas and oil development is above any other commodity in the American market.
Humphrey, deeply concerned that the momentum toward war in South Vietnam was going to completely overwhelm anybody's ability to keep up with it, to tamp it down, to slow it down, so the probable consequences of it could be examined, Humphrey decides to write his president a memo. Mr. President, he said, this is not Korea. It is not clear. You're not going to be able to explain this to the American people. It's going to chew up American boys, and you're not going to be able to say why. Mr. President, you must have noticed that our key allies, they're seeing this buildup in Southeast Asia all around South Vietnam, and they're worried. What's going to happen? Are we going to go to war there? Is that what we care about? Our allies, France, West Germany, and England, think that the #1 priority should be Europe. I, Hubert Humphrey, think it should be Europe. You're the expert on the Congress. Have you noticed that all of the committee chairmen are opposed? And have you noticed what's happened in South Vietnam since President Kennedy died? It's gotten worse and worse and worse, to the point where we don't even know who we're supporting half the time, to the point where the Viet Cong now control more than 50% of the country. South Vietnam's a basket case. There is no South Vietnamese government to speak of unless you're talking about the U.S. advisors to that government. The Viet Cong is an insurgency. It has managed to win the hearts and minds of the people of South Vietnam. No matter what we may think of communist ideology, it's working. Do we have a message that we can deliver at that level to those people? Are we credible? Do we know the Vietnamese language, culture, history? We don't. If we choose to go to war, if you, Mr. President, make that choice to go to war, you'll have to consider that we won't know what we're doing. In other words, what's happened? Hubert Humphrey has done his president and the world the great favor of laying in front of Johnson the political arguments, the arguments about the politics of Vietnam. He's laid them out crystal clear in a 3.5-page memo, given it to Johnson. He's not copied it. And now we ask, what happens? Johnson refused even to give Humphrey a meeting. He subsequently blackballed Hubert Humphrey. He expelled him from all meetings having to do with Vietnam. Based on this memo and some speeches that Humphrey had given, he urges his colleagues, when they're with Humphrey, to, in effect, keep him under surveillance.
He told Hubert to clear very carefully what he said in New York with you.
He did.
Well, I see he's got a good deal of negotiation in it.
No, I don't think so. That's the way I read it.
I would just as soon his stay out of the peacekeeping and negotiating field at this ticklish point, so let's just watch him very carefully. I told him the other day, I said, you're really the last man. If I were you, I'd try to stay on some of these subjects that you're dealing with and not get into negotiating. I just really, I feel very deeply that God, I want to negotiate more than any man in the world. I'll guarantee you that.
I'll bet.
But I don't think negotiation, my wanting to negotiate, is necessarily the best way to win the girl.
Exactly.
And so let's be awfully careful with everybody on them, and I'm going to tell them to clear things with you and Bill on these various programs that they're speaking on.
I think Humphrey, in fact, stayed within the lines of policy. But
let's watch the negotiation thing pretty generally by all of them. You better tell Bill that, because he's liable to give out an interview with somebody, and let's see that we all right it this time.
Right.
And we shall fight the battle against aggression in Vietnam to a successful conclusion. And throughout the world, we shall fight the battle for peace. And to the American people who have given us their strength in every hour of trial, I say to you that we shall fight all of these battles successfully.
And President John F. Kennedy said in 1962, withdrawal in the case of Vietnam might mean a collapse of the entire area. A year later, he reaffirmed, and I quote, that we are not going to withdraw from that effort. We just must not mislead the enemy. Let him not think that debate and dissent will produce wavering and withdrawal. for I can assure you they won't. And so the true peacekeepers in the world tonight are not those who urge us to retire from the field in Vietnam, who tell us to try to find the quickest, cheapest exit from that tormented land, no matter what the consequences to us may be. The true peacekeepers are those men who stand out there on the DMZ at this very hour, taking the worst that the enemy can give. The true peacekeepers are the soldiers who are breaking the terrorist grip. My fellow Americans, not long ago I received a letter from a woman in the Midwest. She wrote, "Dear Mr. President, in my humble way I am writing to you about the crisis in Vietnam. I have a son who is now in Vietnam. My husband served in World War II. Our country was at war. But now, this time, it's just something that I don't understand. Why? Well, I've tried to answer that question dozens of times and more. Americans have gone to far lands to fight for freedom. We have learned at a terrible and a brutal cost that retreat does not bring safety, and weakness does not bring peace. And it is this lesson that has brought us to Vietnam. No better words could describe our present course than those once spoken by the great Thomas Jefferson. It is the melancholy law of human societies to be compelled sometimes to choose a great evil in order to ward off a greater evil. We have chosen to fight a limited war in Vietnam in an attempt to prevent a larger war. For the end is not yet. I cannot promise you that it will come this year or come next year. Our adversary still believes, I think tonight, that he can go on fighting longer than we can. Good evening, my fellow Americans. Tonight I want to speak to you of peace in Vietnam and Southeast Asia. No other question so preoccupies our people. Many men on both sides of the struggle will be lost. A nation that has already suffered 20 years of warfare will suffer once again. Armies on both sides will take new casualties, and the war will go on. There is no need for this to be so. I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Lyndon Johnson suffered terribly because of the Vietnam War. It prevented him from doing what he wanted to do. He was just broken by this war. I'm sure his life ended prematurely because of this war. He did not enjoy dealing with this war. He hated it. But a president has to choose, and Lyndon Johnson signed that piece of paper, sending 180,000 combat troops to General William Westmoreland in Saigon, the field commander over there, and he told him to win the war. He made that choice. Lady Bird Johnson's diary contains many entries along the following lines. I wish poor Lyndon had never taken this job. I wish poor Lyndon had never heard of Vietnam. He's sick. He throws up at night. He's drinking too heavily. He heads down the hallway in the middle of the night and asks the CIA guy in charge in the Situation Room, how many boys have we lost since I went to bed? And it's not Johnson's fault, and it's not necessarily to Kennedy's credit. he was a different kind of president. It makes a big difference, I think, who we elect as president in matters of war and peace.
Yes, I think the American people ought to understand that there's no quick solution to the problem that we face there. I would not want to prophesy or predict whether it would be a matter of months or years or decades. I do not know that we had any accurate timetable on how long it would take to bring victory in World War I. I don't think anyone really knew whether it would be 2 years or 4 years or 6 years to meet with success in World War II. I cannot foresee what next year, the following year will hold. I only know that the Americans will do whatever is necessary. I do not want to speculate on the reactions of other people. This nation is prepared and will always be prepared to protect its national interests.
We intend to bury no one. And we do not intend to be buried.
Watch this documentary in full and more online at sbs.com.au/ondemand.